So, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this early hour, especially those of you who have traveled from overseas. I'm sure that must be quite difficult with the jet lag. We'll just briefly talk a bit about the idea behind this year's conference and tell you a bit more about what you can expect over the next 3 days. So this year, the 30th anniversary of the events of 1989, which brought down the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, invites us to look back upon the past 3 decades. With this conference, we would like to reflect not upon this date itself, nor how the changes of 1989 have been commemorated, but rather what came after and how we remember it today. With the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, former communist countries quickly embarked on the path of transforming from a Soviet-style state-run economy to a capitalist free market along neoliberal lines. This topic seemed particularly timely to us as increasingly we are witnessing public discourse in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe turning away from its preoccupation with the trauma of the communist past and instead focusing on the transformation, the advantages it brought, but also the social and political problems it produced. We are thus also seeing an evolution of the discourse on 1989 itself, because it is our contention that the memory of this event is necessarily retrospectively colored by how the ensuing period is remembered, not only as a time of unconditional freedom, but also a time when this freedom came at a certain price, at least for some sections of East European societies. So our aim in this conference is to go beyond understandings of 1989 as a pivotal turning point and focus on the memory of the longer process of change in the Eastern Bloc, which resulted from longer economic histories in the post-war Western world. Undoubtedly, there were and still will be many academic events dedicated to 1989 and its aftermath this year. The intervention of this conference is to examine the memory of economy-related aspects of change. The transformation of the very nature of the economic system had profound effects on everyday lives and the shape of societies, which have been plentifully studied by sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists, and increasingly also historians. But this radical remodeling of the economic sphere and all the attendant social processes are almost never discussed in terms of memory, how societies, groups, and individuals look back upon those often bewildering changes. Indeed, economy-related aspects of memory are also rarely discussed in memory studies. Only recently have we witnessed the rise of interest in class and trade union memories, for instance. From this angle, we hope that this conference is a contribution not only to the memory of the transformation, but also to memory studies in general. Collective memory is a battle for values, emotions, and stories. Historical events are commemorated and used in official memory politics as foundational narratives that are often instrumentalized by politicians and other stakeholders to legitimize the current order. These have often gained the status of myth, as well-rehearsed, often repeated, and accepted narratives told about the transformation. At this conference, we would like to question, analyze, and historicize these myths. But our approach is not limited to the sphere of elite discourses, and in inviting contributions for this conference, we sought approaches that take both top-down and bottom-up perspectives, analyzing the memory of the transformations from the point of view of a variety of social and cultural groups and settings. Our hope is that such a multifaceted approach can also help us move beyond the populism and neoliberalism dichotomy that dominates much current political analysis. The 1990s are increasingly looked to for answers as to why we have found ourselves in the current situation of the global resurgence of nationalism. By looking at the memory of the 1990s, we can uncover some of the processes that contributed to this, whether, just for example, by examining how workers' memories of the privatization processes of the 1990s contribute to their feelings of disenfranchisement, or how the memory of non-transparent transformation processes is fueling resentment towards financial elites.
Let me briefly comment on the state of the art and our expectation relating to this conference. The political, social, and cultural memory of state socialism have been extensively studied and have even produced a whole subfield of studies dedicated at the one hand to the politics of memory, politics of history, or policies of history, if you will, and the post-socialist nostalgia for the former regime on the other. We have discussed those topics at our former Genealogies of Memory conferences. However, the memory of the transformation, as Veronika pointed to, itself is still a developing field, especially when it comes to vernacular memory of specific social groups. Again, the 1990s themselves have, of course, been a subject of study other than memory studies. A robust transitology literature has covered the democratization processes in the former Eastern Bloc from political studies, economic, sociological, and anthropological perspectives. Much work has been done on questions of transitional justice, a set of legal measures which sought to officially define how the legacies of state socialism should be tackled. Nowadays, the state of the research on the transformation can perhaps itself to be considered a form of memory. We would like to move further to establish memory of transformation as a research focus in its own right. Globalized studies of 1989 have already set this event in a wider transnational context beyond the former Eastern Bloc and have worked to overcome the national and nation-state perspectives, which is often the container for studies of memory, especially when it comes to memory politics. Among this important and necessary work, we would like to point out to the research project 1989 after 1989, led by James Mark. We are very pleased to be able to welcome James and Jakob and Tobias from his team at this conference to discuss the recent book on the global history of 1989 in a roundtable later today. Let me quote a fragment of this book now so you can feel it. As opposed to the widespread image of largely isolated countries, Eastern European socialist states had been closely linked with many countries of the global South and East Asia. Authoritarian leaders did not simply give way to liberal democracy. Some took the end of state socialism in Eastern Europe as a warning and successfully adapted their political system to the geopolitics of the post-Cold War world. But we also feel that macro-political and economic approaches, while giving necessary historical background, can obscure the perspective of actors on the ground. We thus want to investigate in these conferences the different scales of memory of transition side by side and in conversation with one another, from the global through the national and regional to the local, giving special recognition to the social space and vernacular memories of transition period. Oral historians are increasingly turning to the 1990s from the perspective of ordinary people. Here, the work of the Oral History Center at the Institute for Contemporary History in Prague is pioneering. Of recent publication, we can mention, for instance, Lenka Kratka's studies on the changes in the Czech business culture after 1989, or a recent project which covered recollection of the 1990s as seen by students who took part in the events of the Velvet Revolution, in which Veronika Pehe was a team member.
And we certainly also shouldn't forget sociologists who are increasingly returning to the transformation and how it is remembered amongst particular social groups. And here I would also like to highlight Joanna Wawrzyniak's project on the memory of staff in privatized enterprises in Poland, about which you'll hear more later during this conference. In general, it remains the case that despite more and more academic and media attention, the 1990s have not yet been worked through in the public sphere. Our ambition is to uncover how different groups talk about their experience of the 1990s and how this differs from official commemorations. Our aim is thus to look for the language and instruments to talk about the diverse memory processes regarding the economic transformation. And our hope is that this conference will contribute to establishing such vocabularies. We hope that our discussions will allow us to uncover some of the common points across thematic and disciplinary approaches.
So our initial point of departure is the assertion that we cannot understand the East European transformation without the global histories of socialism and neoliberalism. As the conference progresses, we move down the scales of memory, going through discussion of transnational to national aspects to vernacular memory and cultural representations. These are all complementary approaches. None can be understood without the others, and therefore the program covers 4 main topics: key narratives, discourses of national memory, and foundational myths. Here we'll focus on how the political narratives of the economic transformation have been shaped. Second, we will move on to social memory, analyzing the hopes and frustration and the horizons of expectations of different sections of society in relation to the transformation and how these are remembered today. The third central topic deals with the labor as the foundational process of economic production. How can we study the memory of workers in changing economic and political conditions? And finally, during the upcoming 3 days, we will also focus on popular culture and how it produces the memory of the economic transformation, including current uses and reuses of this memory in contemporary social media and material culture. Our exploration of culture memory will also be complemented by a film screening on Tuesday of one of Poland's most emblematic transformation film, The Dead, Dług by Krzysztof Krause, together with an introduction and debate with film scholar Mateusz Werner and again Veronika Pehe, who focuses in her new research on cultural representation of transformation. We are above all very pleased to have 4 distinguished keynotes who will reflect upon these different strands of the memory of the transformation. We will start the conference in a moment with a keynote by Professor Joanna Bockman, who will set the topics we want to think about in a wider context beyond the East-West dichotomy. From this global opening, we will move down the scale to look at the intertwined histories and memories of transformation and unification in Germany in Professor Thomas Linderberger's lecture. And on the final day, we will have the opportunity to zoom in on a specific group in Professor Adam Mrozowicki's lectures on the memory of labor and workers in Poland. Finally, we will close our series of keynotes with Professor Martin Schulze-Wessel's talk on policy legitimations in the transformation period. We are delighted to have such prominent guests and intense and diverse program over the next 3 days, which we hope will produce a stimulating discussion.
And of course, before we actually start, we have to point out that this conference would not have been possible without the dedicated work of a number of institutions and individuals. The previous speakers, Director Rafał Rogulski and Małgorzata Pakier, have already thanked our partners and sponsors, and it is our due to thank them in turn and the European Network Remembrance and Solidarity for inviting us to organize this year's conference. And I would also like to reiterate what we already heard. Special thanks go to Antoni Zakrzewski, who has been in touch with many of you. He has done an incredible amount of work taking care of all the practical organizational matters to do with this conference, and it's really thanks to him that we can be sure everything will run smoothly over the next 3 days. So thank you, Antoni. And just finally, some practical information. We would like to ask all panelists to stick to 20-minute presentations and for chairs to keep the time. After all the presenters have spoken in each panel, we will have a short response or commentary from the chair, who will also act as a discussant. And after that, we will open the floor to discussion. And last but not least, as was already mentioned, we intend to publish a volume resulting from this conference. We'll be in touch about that later. So we encourage everyone to look for the common themes and lines of inquiry in the discussions to make this into an inspiring exploration of the memory of the economic changes after 1989. Thank you.